The leader of the National Resistance Forces visits Makha port to tangibly check the mass damage caused by Houthi terrorist attack. The Joint Forces announced investigation results of Houthi attacks on Makha. While the world celebrates the International Day of Democracy, Houthi continue human rights violations against journalists and free press. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Rushan Fouad. Brigadier General Tariq Mohammed Abdullah Saleh, leader of the National Resistance, paid an inspection visit to the port of Makha. The visit is the second since the port was attacked by the Iranian-backed Houthi militia. During the visit, Brigadier Tariq praised efforts made by the port staff to continue its operation after the Houthi attack. He was briefed on the damage caused to the port, including the warehouses for relief aids. He confirmed that Houthi criminal attack on Makha port comes in the context of their implementation of the Iranian project to control the region. Brigadier General Sadiq Duwait, commander of the Joint Forces, announced on Wednesday the investigation results of the Houthi attack on the port of Makha last Saturday. Duwait said that the Houthi rebels targeted the Makha port with heavy bombardment, which affected almost all of the port's infrastructure facilities. As to the evacuation plan, he said that civilian workers and residents of the area surrounding the port were evacuated, and the Joint Forces managed to shoot down and destroy some of the Houthi attack missiles.
أقدمت عصابة الحوثي الإيرانية يوم السبت الموافق 11 سبتمبر 2021.
On Saturday, September 11, 2021, during working hours, the Houthi militia targeted the Makha port with heavy bombing that affected almost all of the port's facilities, its berth, warehouses, employees' offices, and the commercial boats anchored there. Members of the joint forces from various units led by military intelligence, Coast Guard, and port security were able to thwart this crime by activating passive and air defenses. The Houthi militia used 2 ballistic missiles and 6 Iranian-made drones, and our air defenses were able to shoot down half of them. The militia attack destroyed a number of warehouses in the port, including goods and a warehouse for the Humanitarian Action Unit containing large quantities of food products provided by the Emirates Red Crescent. The attack also destroyed a number of port offices and damaged its berth. The port of Makha returned service after the inauguration in the presence of the representative of the United Nations, Mr. David Grizzly, as a civil port, subject to the International Code ISPS code, and supervised by the International Maritime Organization IMO through the Maritime Affairs Authority, and has an international certificate of compliance. This shelling was planned to commit a horrific crime, as it was during a visit of a high-ranking government delegation from the Ministry of Transport. This crime and other Houthi crimes will not stop the port from its work and will not discourage the joint forces and the local authority from continuing to operate the port and operating all development projects in this precious part of the country despite the Houthi aggression.
City of Makha witnessed during the last days massive demonstrations to condemn Houthi attack on Makha port with missiles and drones. Meanwhile, international community remained silent. In Hodeidah, clashes renewed in Hais between the Joint Forces and the Houthi rebels. The military media of the Joint Forces reported that Houthis fired their machine guns at houses of citizens. The media asserted that Houthi rebels were inflicted with casualties during those clashes. The U.S. envoy to Yemen, Tim Lenderking, said that Houthi military escalations in Ma'rib must stop. During a meeting on the humanitarian response plan in Yemen, Lenderking said that coordinated efforts with the United Nations are continuing to push Houthis to stop their offensive in Ma'rib. He stressed that improving humanitarian operations is required to progress in the political track. The United Nations Eminent Expert Group on Yemen announced that the conflict in the country is getting more and more complex. Yemen's ambassador in Geneva, Ali Mujawar, said that Yemen refuses to accept the report issued by TEAM. More on this story is within this report.
The report presented by the eminent expert group concerning human rights in Yemen was totally refused by the Arabs UN's group. The group's report recorded from their point of view violations and abuses committed in Yemen between July 2020 and June 2021. It was entitled A Forgotten Nation, a Call for Humanity to End Yemen's Suffering. The refusal was built upon the fact that the group depended in its finding on only one source. According to the Arab members supported by China, the group should have depended on all the sources and should have reached all the places in Yemen to find the truth. In this context, Yemen's ambassador in Geneva, Ali Mujawar, said that his country's government refuses to accept those experts appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council. According to him, the report issued by the team is rejected as the team relied on misleading information, and the government adheres to the report of the Independent National Commission charged with investigating allegations of human rights violations. For them, the group of experts presented its fourth report that covers the findings on human rights violations, which was recorded last year. The violations, according to them, include shelling, failing to abide principles of international humanitarian law, obstacles to access food, health care, enforced disappearance, gender-based violence. The report included also torture and other forms of inhuman and degrading treatment, denial of fair trial rights, violations of fundamental freedoms. The UN group recorded in their group incidents of persecution and violations against journalists, migrants, internally displaced people, and children. They urged to reach a full cessation of hostilities and to achieve a sustainable and exclusive peace. The UN group of eminent experts was mandated to carry out comprehensive examinations of alleged violations and abuses of international human rights committed in Yemen.
Human Rights Watch said that investigations have been documented widespread violations of the terrorist Houthi militia. These violations included arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, and torture in detention centers. The organization confirmed that the Irani-backed Houthi militia is detaining and prosecuting opponents, including religious minorities, women, and journalists, noting that Houthi militia attacks in Ma'rib put civilians at great risk. Vulnerable children are the most hit by the devastating war. Houthi's human rights violations against children have added to their suffering. The following report has more details on that story.
A simple scene summarizing the bitter reality of Yemen being kidnapped by the Irani-backed militia is just by looking at children. Yes, children of Yemen are the future of Yemen, and since the Irani-backed militia has recruited children on the battlefields and thrown them as war fuel and as human shields, they are gradually losing the way to the future. Thus the conscience disappeared, the vision disappeared, and the future died in the eyes of the children of Yemen. The Houthi militia target students to recruit them and tamper with their ideas. Militias made more than 300 modifications to school curriculum and included in the curriculum lessons to sanctify Houthi leaders and urge students to fight with them. They also opened offices in institutions to register the names of students to push them to fight. Months after joining the summer centers organized by the Houthis in Yemen, a 15-year-old Samir told his family that he would join the battlefronts, despite his parents' refusal to finally receive him as a dead body at a time when recruitment campaigns continue, which doesn't exclude accusations of involvement in any of the parties to the conflict. Samir's father, who preferred not to reveal his identity, explained that the beginning was with his family's approval for his son to join the summer centers during the annual school holiday, to learn religious lessons and other courses and activities that attract the attention of boys, and upon returning to his family, the impact of the concepts and lessons he received is clear in his behavior, up to expressing his desire to join the front for jihad for the sake of God and defense of the homeland. Although Samir's mother and father initially refused to enlist him, with the passage of time, his poor family's anxiety subsided as he would return to them every few months and provide them with money that helps them provide some household needs. This situation did not last long, as the last time he returned to his family dead and with his body, a picture in a frame with his name written as a martyr, to be hung by his family on the walls of the house. Samir's case is not much different in its details from what was witnessed in one of the neighborhoods near his family's residence in Sana'a, where the 3 dead residents of the neighborhood, aged between 15 and 16 years, Ahmed, Yusuf and Muhammad, were buried. They joined the fronts more than a year ago, and after that they were returning intermittently to their families. The 3 later died in a site believed to have been directly bombed and returned in small coffins to be buried in a sad atmosphere by the residents of the neighborhood. Those innocent children who were supposed to be playing or studying at school like many others at their same age, now they find themselves out of school with no future. Their innocence has been kidnapped from them, and instead of holding their bags or a ball to play with, they find themselves holding weapons instead and fighting their own friends and neighbors. And most of all, coming back to their families in coffins. What a crime! The picture must be clear and repeated until the Yemeni chooses between a prosperous future and remaining as a game in the hands of a gang that has provided Yemen with nothing but destruction, ruin, and employment of the Persians.
The world celebrates International Democracy Day, while Houthi rebels continue to crack down journalists and silence free speech. Journalists have been kidnapped, detained, and even sentenced to death. This report sheds light on these violations committed against journalists in Yemen.
Although Houthi militia has closed all opposition and independent newspapers and foreign media offices in areas under its control, the militia is on top of the lists of press freedoms violators in Yemen. The militia continue arresting journalists, 4 of whom have been sentenced to death. The Yemeni Journalist Syndicate released a report in the first half of 2021 over press freedom violations that affected all media employees, correspondents, media institutions, and journalists' properties. In its latest report, the Yemeni Journalist Syndicate recorded 112 cases of violations. These violations varied between kidnapping, detention, threats, incitement, stalking, and prevention of coverage, confiscation of newspapers, and accountability of journalists. According to the report, the Houthi militia committed 20 cases of violations, the government 10 cases, while the Southern Transitional Council committed 6 cases of violations against press freedom. However, 9 journalists are still detained by the Houthi militia: Wahid al-Sufi, Abdul Khaliq Umran, توفيق المنصوري, أكرم الوليدي, حارث حامد, نبيل السدوي, Muhammad al-Salahi, Walid al-Matari, and Muhammad Ali al-Junaid, 4 of whom have been unfairly sentenced to death. Likewise, journalist Muhammad Qaid al-Maqri has been kidnapped by Al-Qaeda in Hadramaut since 2015. The International Federation of Journalists condemned the ongoing violence against Yemeni journalists and called to end impunity culture. The Federation announced its support for the Yemeni Journalist Syndicate that requested an immediate release of all media employees and called on the warring parties to respect press freedom. The Yemeni Journalist Syndicate stated that journalists and media violations have increased significantly, especially against those who oppose their rule. Media freedom in Yemen has been subjected to more than 1,400 violations since the beginning of the war, including 38 killings of journalists, photographers, and other media employees. Since 2015, Yemen has become one of the most dangerous areas for journalist safety, especially with impunity that led to a scarcity of news coverage of the Yemeni crisis. Meanwhile, the Secretary General of the International Federation of Journalists, Anthony Belangi, said, "The Federation and the Journalist Syndicate condemn this ongoing violence against media in Yemen. All kidnapped journalists must be released and death sentences must be quashed immediately. We urge the authorities to take urgent actions to ensure the safety of journalists and end impunity for crimes committed against journalists and media workers," Belangi added. Journalists suffer no less than the rest of those affected by the war, as they make great efforts and go under life risks to convey the suffering of the Yemeni people despite the violations they receive, especially from the Houthi militia.
An armed force in Maghreb arrested the human rights activist Amatullah al-Hamadi and sent her in prison without justification. This attack came after a campaign of incitement launched by Muslim Brotherhood activists on social media, accusing her of working for the Houthis. The campaign came after the activist revealed the detention of a child in one of Maghreb prisons, where he was subjected to sexual assault by security officials. Coming next. Inflation hits healthy controlled areas amid people suffering.
منذ ثالث سنين على منطقة الروضة استهدف الأطفال الأبرياء اللي يلعبوا في الشارع، يدعي للسلام يقول له للسلام يقتل أطفالنا، يقتل أطفالنا الأبرياء.
أنا قلت استجعت ولا أقول معي واحد صاروخ ثاني، طلعت البيت حقنا عشان ألعب أنا وأصحابي والصاروخ انطرح.
Welcome back. To Aden, to the south of Yemen, where a wave of angry rallies continued in the city for the second night over constant power cuts. Sources confirmed that demonstrators set fire in tires to cut off the main street in Crater City. They protested against the deterioration of living conditions and basic services, especially electricity. The demonstrators called on authorities to provide services, stop the continuous collapse of the national currency, and pay the salaries of employees. To that end, Aden Association for Foreign Exchange directed all companies in the banking sector to start a public strike. They announced the strike will begin Wednesday in all governorates until further notice. The association revealed that the call for the strike comes in protest against the deterioration of the national currency. In the same line, angry protests continued in Hadramaut, east of Yemen, as basic services continue to worsen in the city. Local residents said protesters blocked several streets while stores were closed in Sheher. The wave of protests entered its third day in a row and included a number of districts in Hadramaut. The economic situation in Yemen is continuing to collapse because of war and the absence of basic commodities. This aggravated people's suffering, especially in the Houthi-controlled areas. More on this story is within this report.
Food prices have risen in Yemen in 2021 due to the conditions it's going through and the turmoil of the political situation, in addition to the emergence of the coronavirus and the pandemic that the whole world is witnessing, which led to a rise in food prices in Yemen, Sana'a, Aden, and most of the Yemeni regions. This made a large number of families complain about the poor living conditions in light of this rise. Food prices in Sana'a and Yemen also witnessed a noticeable rise, as Yemen imports 90% of its food and consumer demand. Many food and consumer products were affected by the wave of crazy high prices that swept the Yemeni market. Salaries were cut off in the Houthi coup militia's areas of control for more than 2 years, and the Houthis rejected a government offer in 2016 to deposit all the revenues they receive at the headquarters of the Central Bank of Yemen in the temporary capital Aden, in return for disbursing the salaries of employees in their areas. The prices of some foodstuffs in the city of Sana'a and the areas under the control of the Houthi coup militia increased between 30 to 40%, while the prices of other foodstuffs increased by more than 3 times their price. The price of one bag of flour, a package of 50 kilos, reached 14,000 Yemeni riyals, which is equivalent to $22, after it was previously sold at a price of 10,000 riyals. While the price of a gallon of oil, 20 liters, reached 21,500 riyals, which is equivalent to $36. After that was being sold for $13. The United Nations stated that the conflict in Yemen 6 years ago has left at least 24.1 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, including 12.3 million children and 3.7 million internally displaced people. The United Nations indicated that about 70% of the population is facing the risk of hunger in a country that's already among the most food insecure countries in the world. Merchants in Sana'a attributed the reasons for the rise in prices to the Houthis imposing new taxes and royalties under various names, which burdened the citizen and the merchant at the same time, as well as the high prices of oil derivatives, which in turn is reflected in the wages of transporting foodstuffs. In a recent report, the World Bank said that the conflict has devastated the national economy, with GDP halving since 2015, pushing more than 80% of the total population below the poverty line. High prices, black market, and the unpaid salaries of Yemenis are all factors affecting their life on a daily basis and doubling their pain more and more. All of this because of these Irani-backed Houthi militia who does nothing but ruin, destroy, and add pain to all Yemenis.
Here's a reminder of the main headlines. The leader of the National Resistance Forces visits Makha port to tangibly check the mass damage caused by Houthi terrorist attacks. The joint forces announced investigation results of Houthi attacks in Makha port. While the world celebrates the International Day of Democracy, Houthis continue human rights violations against journalists and free press. This is the end of the news. It was Roshan Fouad. See you soon.